Blumhouse. Big month. Two massive horror IPs lined up. You had an Exorcist sequel for the 50th anniversary of the original, and the first big screen adaptation of one of the most powerhouse horror IPs to hit gaming in a long time, with an absolutely massive fan base. You had two golden balls sitting on batting tees, shining in the sun of potential. And you swung, but you forgot to hold the bat. The fuck are you guys doing? Good evening. My name's Evan, and welcome to Rocklin Graves. This one's been a long time coming. Five Nights at Freddy's had a ton of trouble with getting into production, and the anticipation for this thing was getting out of hand in the circles of people who love this IP. It's written by Scott Cawthon, the original creator of the games, as well as Seth Cudback and Emma Tammy, who's also the director. I played the first game back right when it came out, and I genuinely really liked it, and I still do, but beyond that, I didn't attach much to the others and never dove into the lore, so I'm really coming at this from the perspective of an uninitiated viewer. Before I say what I'm gonna say about this movie, I got a lot of joy out of being in the theater surrounded by a younger crowd that was getting to see the horror franchise that they grew up getting invested in brought to the big screen for the first time. There was a bunch of 12 to 16-year-olds just losing their minds at all the nods to the games and having an absolute blast from start to finish. There were a number of times where the crowd went nuts over something that just went right over my head, and even though I was confused and maybe didn't find the humor nearly as funny as they did, people were in hysterics at points. I really enjoyed being around that and seeing these people get their gateway horror movie that could lead to a lifetime of love for the genre. We all know how exciting it is to see your franchise on the big screen, and I'm glad that I got to see these people get theirs. This movie wasn't made for me, it was made for them, and they were having the time of their lives. It was very heartwarming, and it reminded me of what that feels like. All of that was wonderful and nice. But it didn't change that this is probably the most bored I've been in a theater all year. I never expected this movie to be amazing, but I definitely didn't expect it to be as bad as I found it to be. At the very least, you can tell that Scott Cawthon's involvement had a major effect on the final product, because the attention to detail in making this feel like something made by someone who really understands the games and its fans was very strong. The Exorcist Believer didn't feel like it was made by people passionate about The Exorcist, and where that's concerned, this movie did succeed. Easily the best thing about Five Nights at Freddy's is something that was super apparent in the trailers, and that's the incredible practical designs of the animatronics from Jim Henson's Creature Shop. From what I can tell, they're perfect, one-to-one with how they look in the game. It was really impressive, and they didn't move like people in costumes, they moved like actual animatronics, so hats off for all the performances as well. Honestly, the set design of Freddy Fazbear's was just great overall. There's so much detail in these sets that made the movie feel a lot more credible, and I think it's that strong sense of this being made by people who care that held everything together for the crowd. It is filled to the brim with fan service, so if you're super into this franchise, you could definitely have a fun time with all of that. But as someone who's just not invested in it and was watching it purely on its own merits, I was really struggling to pay attention more than I have in a theater in a very long time. I've thought since this movie was announced that it would be very difficult to adapt the story to a movie like this, because the way that those games unveiled their stories was very cryptic and vague, which is a huge reason that the fan base grew so large. I love FromSoft games, so I fully get how much fun it is to have a community of fans piecing together the story, and without that sense of mystery, this thing did not work. The subject matter is pretty dark, so I was also curious how they'd handled that sort of thing, and what was really frustrating is that they don't go super in detail about the backstory, because they were trying to make this a PG-13 movie so they could bring in the generally younger fan base, and that's fine if you don't want to go into detail about it, but you need to have some sense of intrigue to keep the viewer engaged. Instead of that, they just dance around the backstory being revealed in the most lazy way possible, and then there's this B-plot with a custody battle that was so disconnected from the main storyline and had absolutely zero tension and no payoff. The characters don't really go through much of an arc. There's very much a sense of like stasis with every character in this movie. It's completely understandable that they wouldn't want to make this a really dark movie because the fan base is mostly younger, but that puts them in a weird position where they have to find a way to tell this story in an interesting way that either altered the lore behind the pizzeria or told it in a way that would make it presentable as a PG-13 movie. But instead of that, they just omit details and then fill the runtime up with the most surface level attempt at character development, hoping that it'll grab people enough through to the end. I couldn't find much of anything in this movie that I could latch onto as a source of entertainment. It desperately needed some sense of mystery or a strong build-up to slowly unveil things and make you try and piece together what's going on, but even being mostly unaware of the backstory, it was all so predictable. And on top of that, there's absolutely zero buildup of tension or suspense with the animatronics. It feels like these great pieces are wasted and they weren't given the oomph they should have been. Like, there's no moment where you go, holy shit, here we go with them. There's no big reveal. They don't get that moment. They don't get that moment. They don't start out creeping around and slowly get more aggressive. There aren't any like mysterious deaths that later get explained by it being the animatronics. The way it's done is that they kill a group of people on screen. Like, we see them do it, we see exactly who did it and how it was done. It's all right in front of us. And then they pull back and try and make you afraid of them after that. They go right back to like showing hints of being violent and creepy, but they're still being playful. But the problem is that because we've already seen them let loose, there's just zero tension in those scenes, and it feels like the movie's just spinning its wheels. The plot is bare minimum, and while elements of the movie do feel like there was a passionate team of people behind them, the stuff that really matters feels like nothing more than a delivery mechanism to get these iconic characters into a movie theater so they can pander to the hardcore fan base and rake in some money from them. I've made it very clear that even if a movie is mediocre from a storytelling and character perspective, if there's a solid and consistent atmosphere, that goes a long way for me. And that's the thing that really hooked me back when the first game came out. The soundscape and the fuzzy imagery, it was so creepy and unsettling. And even though the gameplay mechanics were very simple, albeit quite engaging, it was the atmosphere that kept me locked in. And that's something that worked for me in plenty of movies that aren't all that great from a writing standpoint. This didn't have any sort of atmosphere for me to latch onto, and after about 30 or so minutes of the shallow narrative, complete lack of tension, and humor that didn't land at all for me, I spent a lot of the time slumped over in my chair and just looking around the theater, just I was hoping that it would pick up at some point and there'd be some interesting turn in the narrative or some holy shit moment when things got really bad to pull me into it, but that never came. I was just waiting for it to end. I'm not someone who usually like checks my watch when I'm watching a movie, but I think I did like 4 times with this one. It committed the biggest sin that a movie can commit. It was just boring. I know they wanted to make this movie years ago, and it ran into so many issues getting off the ground, but this really does feel like it's 5 or 6 years too late. Other people have ripped it off, and this was their chance to say, you can try to recreate it, but here's the real one. And it was lame. Willy's Wonderland is not good, but it was so much more fun than this. I really do think that there's a lot of potential with the story and the atmosphere of Five Nights at Freddy's, but after such a long time in development, aside from the set design and the fantastic practical animatronics, this is just a soulless, bland, bare minimum movie that leans everything it's got on hoping the fan service will be enough to pull fans in, and I'm sure it will. I have no doubt that this movie is going to make a good buck in the theater, and we'll probably be getting sequels down the line, but God almighty, Blumhouse really needs something strong to pick them back up after this month. I should mention that Josh Hutcherson is fine in the lead role, but he's not given enough emotionally interesting material to give a strong performance, and I mean, they even underutilized Matthew Lillard, which should be a criminal offense. At the end of the day, I found this to be a slog to sit through that was a lot less enjoyable than I thought it was going to be, and just left me annoyed and bored by the end. But I am glad that at least the crowd I saw it with seemed to have a blast. I'm happy for them. I decided to delay the Halloween ranking so that it'll be dropping on the 31st, so stay tuned for that, and then I'll also have this year's Rocklin Graves Halloween special out as soon as I possibly can. I've still got a bit more work to do on the display, and I'm excited to compile the process into a video that I'll have out in early November, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.